You're standing in a bustling medieval marketplace, and you desperately need to buy a loaf of bread. You reach into your pocket and pull out, what exactly? A coin? Sure, maybe. But which coin? Made of what? Worth how much? And why is that baker looking at you like you just tried to pay with Monopoly money? Here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval currency. It was an absolute nightmare. We're talking about a time when money could be made of silver, gold, copper, lead, or literally just pieces of leather with stamps on them. A time when the coin you used in London might be completely worthless 20 miles away in the next village. A time when kings would randomly decide to make all the money in their kingdom worth half as much overnight just because they felt like it. And you know what? It gets so much weirder than that. Today, we're diving deep into the bizarre, chaotic, and frankly insane world of medieval money. We're talking about everything from Byzantine gold coins that stayed in circulation for 800 years, to English pennies you could literally cut into pieces, to the time an entire African empire based its economy on salt. Actual salt. The stuff you put on your fries. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval merchants were basically all amateur metallurgists, why getting paid in medieval times often meant receiving several pounds of actual physical metal, and why that scene in every fantasy movie where someone casually tosses a gold coin to a bartender is complete and utter historical nonsense. So grab your coin purse, check your silver for clipping, and whatever you do, don't let anyone catch you shaving precious metal off the edges of your money. That's a hanging offense, literally. Let's talk about what money actually looked like when knights were real and dragons were, regrettably, not. Part 1. The Roman Hangover. Chapter 1. When Rome's money refused to die. Okay, so first things first. The Middle Ages didn't just wake up one morning and invent money from scratch. That would be way too organized for medieval Europe, which spent most of its time being various degrees of on fire. No. Medieval money was basically what happened when the Roman Empire collapsed and everyone scrambled to figure out what to do with all the coins they had lying around. And Rome had left behind a lot of coins. Picture this. It's the year 476 CE, and the Western Roman Empire has just officially collapsed. Congratulations, we're now in the early Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, also known as that period when being able to read made you basically a wizard. But here's the thing, all those Roman coins? They didn't just vanish. People kept using them for centuries, and I mean centuries. There are records of Roman coins being used in trade as late as the year 1000, more than 500 years after Rome fell. That's like us still regularly using Confederate money today. Actually, scratch that. That's a bad example. That's like us still using money from a country that collapsed before America was even discovered. The most important Roman coin that stuck around was the solidus. This was a gold coin introduced by Constantine the Great in 309 CE, and it was built to last, literally. Constantine standardized it at 4.5 grams of pure gold, and that standard held remarkably stable for centuries. In fact, the solidus was so reliable, so consistent, and so universally accepted that it became the standard for international trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Byzantines, who were basically the Eastern Roman Empire refusing to admit Rome had fallen, kept minting the solidus for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. The same coin. Can you imagine the US dollar staying exactly the same for 1,000 years? We can't even keep the same design on our quarters for more than a few years before we have to put some state's monument on it. But here's where it gets interesting. While the Byzantines were minting fresh new solidi with their emperors' faces on them, Western Europe was running on leftover Roman change. It's like when the Soviet Union collapsed, and everyone in Eastern Europe just kept using Soviet money for a while, because nobody had gotten around to printing new stuff yet, except this lasted for literal centuries instead of months. Chapter 2. The Silver Standard. Nobody asked for now. You might be thinking, okay, cool. So medieval Europe just used Roman gold coins. Case closed, right? Wrong. So wrong. Because here's the problem with gold coins. They're really, really valuable. Too valuable, actually. A single gold solidus in the early Middle Ages could buy you a ton of stuff. We're talking enough grain to feed a family for months, or a decent horse, or a really nice sword. You weren't going to use that to buy a loaf of bread. That would be like paying for a coffee today with $1,000 bill. Sure, it's technically money, but the shopkeeper is going to look at you like you've lost your mind. So what did people actually use for everyday transactions? Silver. Lots and lots of silver. The Romans had used silver coins too, the most common being the denarius. But by the time we get to the early Middle Ages, the denarius had gone through so many debasements and reformations that it barely meant anything anymore. So various Germanic kingdoms that had taken over former Roman territories had to figure out their own silver coinage. Enter the Merovingians. These were the Franks who controlled what's now France and parts of Germany, and they were absolutely obsessed with silver coins. They minted thousands of different varieties, and when I say thousands, I mean thousands. We're talking about so many different types of silver coins that modern numismatists have literally cataloged over 20,000 different varieties from the Merovingian period alone. Why so many? Because in the Merovingian system, basically anyone important could mint coins. Kings, sure, but also bishops, abbots, and even some wealthy merchants. Each mint would produce slightly different coins with different weights, different purities, different designs. It was absolute chaos. Imagine if every Walmart in America could print its own dollars, except they're all slightly different sizes, and some of them are mixed with tin. That's basically what Merovingian coinage was like. Chapter 3. Charlemagne finally gets his act together. By the late 700s, this system had become so confusing that Charlemagne, who was busy conquering most of Western Europe and apparently had some spare time, decided to standardize things. And thank God he did, because the Carolingian monetary reform might be the most important thing to happen to medieval money until money stopped being medieval. Here's what Charlemagne did. He established a new standard silver coin called the denarius, which weighed about 1.7 grams. Then he said that 12 of these denarii equaled a solidus, which was now just an accounting unit, not an actual coin, and 240 denarii equaled 1 pound of silver. Now, before your eyes glaze over with all these numbers, here's why this matters. This system became the basis for British currency for the next 1,000 years. That's right. The pounds, shillings, and pence system that Britain only abandoned in 1971 was directly descended from Charlemagne's reform in the 790s. 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. Sound familiar? That came from Charlemagne. A Frankish emperor's monetary system outlasted the Western Roman Empire, the Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the British Empire, and survived all the way to the age of color television. But here's the catch. Charlemagne could standardize all he wanted, but he couldn't actually enforce it everywhere. He controlled a lot of Europe, but he didn't control England, or Scandinavia, or Italy, or Spain. So while the Carolingian system became incredibly influential, it wasn't universal, and this is where medieval money starts to get really, really complicated. Part 2. 1,000 kingdoms, 1,000 currencies. Chapter 4. Why English money was literally cuttable. Let's talk about England, because English medieval money was beautifully practical in the most medieval way possible. The Anglo-Saxons had been minting their own silver coins since the 600s, but they really got into the swing of things after Charlemagne's reforms filtered across the Channel. By the 9th century, England had settled on the silver penny as its basic coin, based on Charlemagne's denarius, but distinctly English. And here's the genius part. These pennies were designed to be cut up. No, seriously. English silver pennies had a cross stamped on them, and this wasn't just decorative. The cross divided the coin into 4 quarters, And if you needed to make change for something that cost less than a penny, you would literally take scissors or a knife and cut the penny along the cross lines into halves or quarters. These pieces had official names. A halfpenny was called a halfpenny, creative, I know, and a quarter penny was called a farthing, from the Old English fjorthing, meaning fourth part. This system actually worked remarkably well. It meant you didn't need to mint a bunch of different denominations, you just needed pennies and a sharp knife. It's like if we still had dollar bills, but you could just tear them in half when you needed to make 50-cent change, except the government actively encouraged it. The English kept using these cuttable pennies for centuries. And we know they were widely cut because archaeologists keep finding these little quarter penny pieces in excavations. Actual medieval change, literally cut from larger coins. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all pennies were created equal. Different mints produced slightly different pennies, and the silver content could vary. So savvy merchants would weigh coins to make sure they were getting their money's worth. And this is where we get to one of the most medieval jobs imaginable, the money changer. Chapter 5, Money Changers, or Why Medieval Banking Was Insane. If you were traveling in medieval Europe, you had a problem. Actually, you had about 1,000 problems, ranging from bandits to plague to the food, but were focused on one specific problem. Your money probably didn't work where you were going. Every kingdom, duchy, county, and sometimes even individual cities had their own coinage. The silver penny you got in London was different from the penny in York, which was different from the penny in Paris, which was different from the penny in Venice, which was different from literally everywhere else. So when you traveled, you needed to exchange your money. Enter the money changer. Money changers set up shop in major cities and trading centers, and their job was to exchange one type of currency for another. But they couldn't just do a simple swap. Oh no, that would be too easy. Instead, they had to 1. Identify what type of coin you had. 2. Determine what mint it came from. 3. Assay it, test it, to see how pure the silver was. 4. Weigh it to make sure no one had shaved metal off the edges. 5. Calculate the exchange rate. 6. Give you the equivalent value in local currency. 7. Take their commission for doing all this work. These guys were basically running a medieval chemistry lab mixed with a currency exchange mixed with a detective agency. They had to be part metallurgist, part mathematician, part con artist detector, and part international relations expert. And they charged accordingly. Commission rates of 5 to 10% were common, which meant that if you were doing any serious traveling, a significant chunk of your money just evaporated in exchange fees. But the really interesting thing about money changers is that they eventually evolved into bankers. Because once you're already weighing coins and calculating exchange rates, it's not that big a leap to start lending money, taking deposits, and issuing credit notes. The famous Medici family started as money changers in Florence. So the next time someone tells you that medieval banking was primitive, remember that medieval bankers had to be able to identify hundreds of different coin types by sight, calculate complex exchange rates in their heads, and spot counterfeit coins from across a room. Modern bankers just need to know how to use Excel. Chapter 6. The Great Debasement Games. Okay, so we've established that medieval money was already confusing. But what really made it chaotic was that kings kept messing with it. See, here's the thing. If you're a medieval king, you have a problem. You need money. Lots of money. You've got wars to fight, castles to build, mistresses to keep in fancy dresses, and all those things cost money. But you can't just raise taxes because your nobles will get upset and might decide to stab you, which was a legitimate concern in medieval politics. So what do? You debase the currency. Here's how it works. Let's say you're minting silver pennies that are supposed to contain 1.7 grams of pure silver. But then you have a brilliant idea. What if you mix the silver with copper? Make the coins 50% silver and 50% copper, and suddenly you can mint twice as many coins from the same amount of silver. Genius, right? You've just doubled your money supply. Except, of course, everyone notices. Merchants aren't stupid. They test the coins, realize they're only half silver, and start demanding 2 of your new coins for what used to cost 1 of the old coins. Congratulations, you've just invented inflation. But medieval kings did this constantly. It was practically their favorite hobby. The French kings were particularly notorious for this. Philip IV of France debased the currency so many times between 1295 and 1314 that people started calling him Philip the Fair, not because he was just, but because of his blonde hair. Though some accounts suggest it was ironic, because there was nothing fair about what he did to the currency. The result was that if you were a merchant holding on to coins for any length of time, you were basically gambling on whether the king would debase the currency before you could spend them. It's like if the government could randomly decide that all $20 bills are now only worth $10, and they could do this whenever they felt like it. This led to some interesting behaviors. People started hoarding old, good coins and only spending the new, debased ones. This is called Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good. Though of course it was happening centuries before Thomas Gresham formulated it. And this is why if you dig up a medieval coin hoard, it's usually full of old, high-quality coins. People buried their good money to hide it from debasement and spent the bad money. Then they died in a plague or a war, or from eating medieval food, and their secret stash stayed buried until some guy with a metal detector found it in 2023. Part 3. The Islamic world had its act together. Chapter 7. The Dinar and Dirham Show. While European kings were busy playing musical chairs with their currency debasements, the Islamic world was over there just making sense, which must have been really annoying for European merchants. Let me paint you a picture. It's the 8th century. The Islamic Caliphate stretches from Spain to India. That's a bigger empire than Rome at its height. And somehow, they managed to maintain a remarkably stable currency system across this entire massive territory. How? Because they actually thought about it for more than 5 minutes. The Islamic monetary system was based on 2 main coins, the gold dinar and the silver dirham. And here's the kicker. These were standardized. Actually standardized. Not standardized until the king needs money for a war, standardized. But we're going to keep this consistent because we're not complete chaos goblins, standardized. The gold dinar was based on, you guessed it, the Byzantine solidus. Because why reinvent the wheel when Rome already made a perfectly good wheel? The early Islamic caliphs took one look at the solidus, thought, yeah, that's solid gold money right there. Pun absolutely intended, and created the dinar at roughly the same weight and purity. The dirham, meanwhile, was based on the Persian drachm, a silver coin from the Sasanian Empire. The early caliphs standardized it at about 2.97 grams of silver. Not 3 grams, not 2.9 grams, but 2.97 grams, because apparently Islamic monetary officials believed in precision. But here's what's really wild. These standards held for centuries. We're talking about coins minted in Baghdad in 800 CE having basically the same weight and purity as coins minted in Cairo in 1100 CE. That's 300 years of monetary stability. In medieval times, while Europe was busy having the monetary equivalent of a temper tantrum. Chapter 8. Islamic coins were basically medieval newspapers. Now, if you were to hold a medieval Islamic coin, the first thing you'd notice is that there are no pictures of people on them, no emperor's face, no caliph's profile, none of that. Why? Because Islamic tradition generally avoided depicting people or animals on coins, viewing it as potentially idolatrous. Instead, Islamic coins were covered in text, lots and lots of text, and this text wasn't just, "This is money, trust us." Oh no. Islamic coins were propaganda machines, religious statements, and historical records all rolled into one tiny piece of metal. A typical dinar or dirham would include Quranic verses, the name of the caliph, the date in the Islamic calendar, the mint city, religious declarations, sometimes even poetry. These coins were basically tiny newspapers that you could spend. Want to know who was ruling when? Check the coins. Want to know what religious message the caliphate was promoting? Check the coins. Want to know which cities had active mints? You guessed it, check the coins. There's a famous example from the Umayyad Caliphate where the Caliph Abd al-Malik completely reformed the coinage in 696 CE. Before that, Islamic coins had been basically copying Byzantine and Persian designs with some Arabic text slapped on. But Abd al-Malik said, enough of this knockoff nonsense, and created entirely new, distinctly Islamic coin designs covered in Arabic calligraphy. The Byzantine emperor was apparently so offended by this that it nearly caused a war. Because apparently, even in the Middle Ages, people took their currency design very seriously. Chapter 9. How Islamic Money Conquered the World. Sort of. Here's something that blows my mind. Islamic coins have been found in places that had literally no connection to the Islamic world. We're talking about dirhams found in Viking hordes in Scandinavia. Thousands of them. Some estimates suggest over 80,000 Islamic silver coins have been found in Sweden alone. Sweden, the land of Vikings and terrible weather. What were Islamic coins doing there? Trade, baby. The Vikings were raiding and trading their way across Europe, and they loved Islamic silver. Why? Because it was good silver, consistent silver, reliable silver, the kind of silver you could trust not to suddenly become half copper because a king needed to fund a new palace. The Vikings were so into Islamic dirhams that they started using them as their standard currency for international trade. They even started making their own imitations. Though being Vikings, they didn't bother to understand Arabic, so their Islamic coins are covered in meaningless squiggles that sort of look like Arabic if you squint. Islamic coins also made it to East Africa, to India, to Central Asia, to Southeast Asia. The dinar and dirham became a sort of international currency, the medieval equivalent of the US dollar. If you were a merchant doing long-distance trade, you wanted payment in dinars or dirhams because you knew those would be accepted anywhere. This was such a big deal that some European kingdoms started minting their own imitations of Islamic coins specifically for trade with the Islamic world and beyond. The Venetians minted a coin called the Matapan that was basically a knockoff dinar. The Crusader states in the Middle East minted coins with Arabic inscriptions even though they were Christian kingdoms because that's what people trusted. It's like if the entire medieval world collectively agreed that Islamic money was just better, even if they wouldn't admit it at dinner parties. Chapter 10. Meanwhile, in China. Okay, so while Europe was fumbling with silver pennies and the Islamic world was perfecting the art of the gold standard, China was over in East Asia doing something completely different and honestly, kind of genius. They were using paper money. No, seriously. China invented paper money during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, and was using it regularly by the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE. Meanwhile, Europe wouldn't see paper money for another several centuries, and even then, Europeans acted like it was some kind of witchcraft. But before we get to paper money, let's talk about what came before. Chinese coins. Chinese coins were weird, and by weird I mean brilliant, but also definitely weird if you're used to European-style round coins with faces on them. Chinese coins were round with a square hole in the middle. Why the square hole? So you could string them together on a cord. Brilliant, right? Instead of carrying a heavy pouch of loose coins that might spill everywhere, you could carry strings of coins. It's like nature's coin roll, except made of string. These coins were called cash, from the Chinese qian, and they were made of bronze or copper, not silver or gold. China had a bronze standard, which was actually pretty clever because bronze is less valuable than gold or silver, meaning you could make low-denomination coins without needing tiny pieces of precious metal. A standard unit was a string of 1,000 cash coins, called a guan. except it was usually actually only 980 or 970 coins, because everyone just accepted that there was a counting fee of 2 to 3%. Medieval Chinese accountants literally built shrinkage into the system. That's some next-level pragmatism. Chapter 11: Flying Money and the Birth of Paper Currency. But here's where it gets really interesting. By the 11th century, Chinese merchants had a problem. They were doing so much business that they needed to carry enormous amounts of these bronze coins around. We're talking about hundreds of pounds of metal for large transactions. Imagine trying to buy a shipload of silk and having to show up with a literal wagon full of bronze coins. It's inefficient, it's dangerous, and it's really hard on your back. So merchants came up with a clever solution. They started leaving their coins with deposit shops and getting receipts instead. These receipts could be exchanged for coins at branches in other cities. Basically, they invented the medieval Chinese version of a checking account. These receipts were called flying money because the paper could fly from place to place while the actual heavy bronze stayed put. And merchants started trading these receipts like money because, well, they were effectively money. The Song Dynasty government looked at this and thought, hey, we should get in on this. So in 1024 CE, the government started issuing official paper money called jiaozi. This was actual, government-backed, legal tender paper money, and it was happening in China 600 years before Europe would get around to trying something similar. The paper money had elaborate designs to prevent counterfeiting, including multiple colors, special seals, and fine details. It also had a limited lifespan, usually 2 or 3 years, after which you had to exchange it for new bills. It's like if your dollar bills had an expiration date, which sounds annoying, but actually helped prevent wear and tear from destroying the money supply. Did it work perfectly? Well, kind of. The Song dynasty managed it reasonably well, but later dynasties, particularly the Yuan, Mongol dynasty, and early Ming dynasty, got a little too excited about printing money and basically inflated their currency into worthlessness. Turns out the ability to print money doesn't mean you should print all the money, which is a lesson that apparently every civilization has to learn the hard way. Part 4: The Stuff That Wasn't Coins at All. Chapter 12: When salt was literally salary all right, buckle up, because we need to talk about commodity money. That's the technical term for things that aren't coins but people use as money anyway because medieval economics was beautifully weird. Let's start with the big one, salt. Yes, salt. The thing you put on your French fries. The thing that's in basically unlimited supply in the ocean. That's salt. In medieval times, salt was incredibly valuable. Why? Because it was the primary way to preserve food before refrigeration. No salt meant no preserved meat, which meant you'd starve in winter. So salt was literally a matter of life and death. In the African Sahara trade routes, salt was so valuable that it was used as currency. Massive slabs of salt, called salt bars, were traded weight for weight with gold in some markets. There's a famous account from the medieval Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, who described seeing markets where salt and gold were exchanged at equal rates. The Mali Empire, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in medieval history, derived much of its wealth from controlling the salt trade. The famous city of Timbuktu was a major trading hub where salt from the Sahara met gold from West Africa. Merchants would literally cross the desert with caravans loaded with salt, trade it for gold and other goods, and cross back. Roman soldiers were partially paid in salt, hence the word salary from the Latin salarium, which referred to money paid to soldiers to buy salt. So when your boss talks about your salary, they're literally using a word that means salt money. You're being paid in metaphorical salt. Delicious. But salt wasn't the only food item used as money. Chapter 13: Pepper, Spice, and Everything Nice that you could buy houses with. Peppercorns. Tiny, dried, black peppercorns. The stuff you grind over your pasta. In medieval Europe, these little guys were worth their weight in gold. Sometimes, literally. Black pepper came from India and Southeast Asia, and getting it to Europe involved a trade route so long and so complicated that it passed through dozens of middlemen, each taking their cut. By the time pepper reached European markets, it was phenomenally expensive. How expensive? Well, there are records of people paying rent in peppercorns. Actual rent, for actual houses. There's a famous term in English law called peppercorn rent, which means a nominal or very small rent payment. But originally, it meant you were actually paying rent with peppercorns because they were valuable enough to do that. When the Visigoth Alaric I besieged Rome in 410 CE, part of his ransom demand was 3,000 pounds of pepper. Not gold, not silver, pepper. Because pepper was that valuable. This wasn't just pepper either. All spices from the East were incredibly valuable. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These were luxury goods that could make you rich if you could get them to Europe. The entire age of exploration basically started because Europeans wanted to find a way to get spices without having to deal with all those middlemen. Christopher Columbus was literally trying to find a shortcut to the spice markets when he accidentally bumped into America. So when you're adding cinnamon to your coffee or pepper to your eggs, remember, you're casually using something that medieval people would have considered a luxury reserved for kings and wealthy merchants. You're living like medieval royalty, at least in terms of spice access. Chapter 14. Cloth, cows, and other creative currencies. But wait, there's more. Because apparently, medieval people looked at coins and thought, but what if we used literally anything else? In medieval England and Scandinavia, cloth was commonly used as currency, specifically standardized lengths of wool cloth called ells or yards. A good piece of cloth was valuable, portable, and always in demand, which made it perfect for trade. Viking society was particularly fond of using cloth as money. Sagas and legal codes from medieval Iceland frequently mention fines and payments being made in hundreds of cloth, standardized measurements of wool fabric. If someone killed your cousin, a common problem in Viking society, they might owe you compensation of, say, 100 ells of cloth plus a cow. Standard medieval legal stuff. Speaking of cows, livestock was absolutely used as currency in many medieval societies. In Ireland, the most common unit of value was the cumal, which literally meant female slave, but by medieval times had become an abstract unit, roughly equivalent to the value of 3 cows. Legal texts from medieval Ireland list fines and prices in cumals, even though no one was actually trading slaves by that point. It had just become a standard unit of account, like how we say bucks instead of dollars. In medieval Russia, squirrel pelts were used as currency. Seriously, there are legal documents and trade records that mention payments in thousands of squirrel pelts. The Mongols who ruled Russia in the 13th and 14th centuries even collected taxes in squirrel pelts. Imagine being a Russian peasant and having to pay your taxes in dead squirrels. Sorry, tax collector, I'm a bit short this year. I only managed to trap 487 squirrels instead of the required 500. Could I pay the difference in beaver pelts? Chapter 15. The problem with cow-based economics. Now, commodity money sounds great in theory. You can't debase a cow. You can't clip pieces off a slab of salt without everyone noticing. Pepper doesn't suddenly lose half its value because the king needs to fund a war. But commodity money has problems. Big problems. First problem. Standardization. All cows are not created equal. A strong, healthy bull is worth way more than a sick, elderly cow. So if you're using cows as currency, you need a way to assess the value of each individual cow. This is doable, but it's complicated. Medieval Irish law actually addressed this. They had elaborate legal classifications for cattle based on age, health, and milk production. A fully mature milk-producing cow was worth more than a heifer, which was worth more than an old cow past her prime. There were literally legal experts whose job was to assess cow value for legal and economic purposes. Medieval cow accountants. Let that sink in. Second problem, Divisibility. If you need to pay someone half a cow's worth, what do? You could pay them half a cow, but then you've got a dead cow that needs to be used quickly before it rots, and also the person you're paying might not want half a dead cow right now. This is why commodity money eventually got replaced by coin money in most sophisticated economies. Coins are standardized, divisible, and they don't rot. They're just better money, even if they are less tasty than pepper. Third problem, storage. Where are you keeping all these cows? All these pelts? All this cloth? It takes up space. Coins you can bury in a pot and dig up later. Try doing that with 100 cows. But despite these problems, commodity money persisted in many places throughout the medieval period, especially in rural areas or in societies that didn't have easy access to precious metals. Because at the end of the day, something is only money if people agree it's money, and people are weird about what they'll agree to. Part 5. Crime, Punishment, and Medieval Monetary Mischief. Chapter 16. The Art of Medieval Counterfeiting and Why You'd Die for It. Let's talk about crime. Specifically, let's talk about the crime that medieval authorities took more seriously than basically anything except treason and murder: counterfeiting. Making fake money in the Middle Ages wasn't just illegal, it was a hanging offense. Actually, scratch that. In many places, it was a boiling offense. As in, they would literally boil you alive in oil or water if you got caught making fake coins. England was particularly enthusiastic about this. Under English law, counterfeiting was considered high treason because coins bore the king's image, so making fake coins was basically forging the king's face, which was insulting his majesty, which was treason. The punishment? For men, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. For women, being burned at the stake. Medieval justice did not mess around. But here's the thing. Despite these absolutely horrific punishments, people counterfeited coins all the time because the potential profit was enormous, and if you were already poor and desperate, the risk of a horrible death might have seemed worth the chance at getting rich. How did medieval counterfeiting work? Well, there were several methods, each with varying levels of sophistication and risk. The crude method: make coins out of base metal like lead or copper, coat them in silver or gold, and hope no one notices. This was the most common method because it was relatively easy. The problem was that these coins were also relatively easy to detect. Any merchant worth their salt, sometimes literally, would test suspicious coins by scratching them, biting them, or rubbing them on a touchstone, a piece of dark stone that would show different colors based on what metal was rubbed on it. The intermediate method: make coins with the correct silver or gold content, but make them lighter than official coins. You'd use official coin dies, stamps if you could steal them, or make your own copies. This was harder to detect but required access to precious metals and, ideally, official dies. The advanced method: sweating coins. This involved putting genuine coins in a bag with something abrasive and shaking them vigorously. Tiny particles of precious metal would wear off and collect in the bag. You'd collect this dust, melt it down, and make new coins from it. The original coins would be slightly lighter, but not so much that anyone would notice immediately. This was basically the medieval equivalent of a salami attack. Tiny amounts stolen from many sources that add up to something significant. And then there was clipping, which deserves its own section. Chapter 17. Clipping, or how to slowly destroy an economy. If counterfeiting was the flashy crime of medieval money, clipping was the insidious one, and it was everywhere. Here's how clipping worked. You take a silver or gold coin, you very carefully cut or file a tiny bit of metal off the edge. The coin still looks basically normal. Maybe the edge is a bit rough, but lots of coins had rough edges from regular wear and tear. You pocket the clippings. Repeat this process with hundreds or thousands of coins, and suddenly you've got enough precious metal shavings to melt down and make new coins or sell as bullion. It's brilliant, it's subtle, and it absolutely destroyed medieval economies when it got out of hand. The problem with clipping is that it's a crime of aggregation. One clipped coin? No big deal. 1,000 clipped coins in circulation? Now you've got a problem. People start noticing that coins are getting lighter. Merchants start demanding more coins for the same goods because they know the coins are underweight. You've got inflation, but it's not because the king debased the currency. It's because thousands of people are all stealing tiny bits of precious metal from every coin they can get their hands on. England in the 1690s had such a severe clipping crisis that an estimated half of all coins in circulation had been clipped. Half. The economy was melting down because nobody trusted the money anymore. This eventually led to the Great Recoinage of 1696, where England called in all the old coins, melted them down, and minted new ones with milled edges, those little ridges you see on the edge of modern coins. Those ridges aren't decorative, they're anti-clipping technology. If a coin's edge is milled, you can instantly see if someone has filed it down. But that was the 1690s. During most of the Middle Ages, coins didn't have milled edges, which meant clipping was rampant and basically impossible to stop. The punishment for clipping was, predictably, horrible. In England, it was considered the same as counterfeiting, high treason, with all the boiling and burning that implied. But people did it anyway, because the crime was so easy to commit and so hard to prove. You know what's wild? The phrase making money hand over fist might actually come from the motion of clipping coins. You'd hold a coin in one hand, clip it with the other, drop the coin in a bag, grab another coin, repeat. Hand over fist, literally making money. Chapter 18. The Merchant's Nightmare. How to not get scammed. Okay, so you're a medieval merchant. You've got goods to sell. Someone wants to buy those goods with money. Simple transaction, right? Wrong. So wrong. First, you need to identify what kind of coins they're offering. Are these English pennies? French deniers? Venetian grossi? Each requires different calculations for value. Second, you need to verify they're genuine. Scratch test, bite test, touchstone. Better do all three if it's a large sum. Third, you need to weigh them. Are they full weight, or has someone been clipping? You need scales, accurate scales. Scales that you're absolutely certain haven't been tampered with, because scale tampering was also a thing. Fourth, you need to assess the purity. Is this actually silver, or is it silver-plated copper? If you're not sure, you might need to do a more destructive assay test, which involves cutting the coin or testing it with acid. Fifth, you need to calculate the exchange rate if these aren't local coins. What's the rate today? Has it changed since yesterday? You need to keep track of this stuff. Sixth, you need to actually count the coins. Medieval counting wasn't like today where you can just run coins through a machine. Every single coin had to be manually counted, often multiple times to make sure. And here's the kicker. You need to do all of this while maintaining a friendly demeanor with your customer, because if you act too suspicious, they might take offense and take their business elsewhere. Or worse, they might be someone important who could make your life difficult. This is why successful medieval merchants were basically required to be experts in metallurgy, mathematics, geography, law, and psychology. They had to know coins from dozens of different mints, understand complex exchange rates that changed constantly, detect counterfeits, assess purity, and read people well enough to spot someone trying to scam them. And they had to do it all without computers, standardized testing equipment, or even reliable reference materials. Most of this knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship and experience. Medieval merchant manuals, basically business textbooks from the Middle Ages, are fascinating documents because they spend huge portions of their content teaching merchants how to handle money. Not how to sell goods, not how to negotiate deals, but how to recognize, test, calculate, and exchange various types of currency. The Pratica della Mercatura, written by Francesco Pegolotti in the 1340s, is essentially a 300-page guide to medieval trade, and a huge chunk of it is just lists of different coins, their values, their exchange rates in different cities, and how to spot fakes. It's like a medieval Yelp review, except instead of rating restaurants, it's rating currencies. Chapter 19. The Weight of Wealth, literally. Here's something modern people don't think about. Medieval money was heavy. Like, really, really heavy. A single gold coin wasn't too bad. Even a handful of silver pennies was manageable. But if you were actually wealthy, if you were moving serious money around, you needed a cart, or several carts. Let's do some math. An English silver penny in the 13th century weighed about 1.4 grams. Doesn't sound like much, right? But there were 240 pennies to a pound sterling. That's about 336 grams of actual silver, which was worth 1 pound, the monetary unit. For any significant transaction, you'd need multiple pounds worth of coins. If you were buying a decent house in medieval London, let's say for £20, which was a lot of money back then, you'd need to show up with approximately 4,800 coins weighing about 6.7 kilograms. That's almost 15 pounds of coins. Try carrying that in your pocket. For really large transactions, the weight became absurd. When Edward I of England paid a war indemnity to Philip IV of France in 1294, the payment was 250,000 livres, roughly equivalent to pounds. That was literally tons of silver. Actual, multiple tons. It had to be transported in multiple wagons with armed guards, and the logistics of just moving the money around took weeks. This is one reason why IOUs, letters of credit, and early banking instruments developed. Moving actual physical money for large transactions was so impractical that merchants started finding ways around it. Italian banking families like the Medici and the Bardi became wealthy partially because they figured out how to facilitate large transactions without actually moving coins around. They'd issue letters of credit that could be redeemed at branches in other cities. It's like medieval wire transfers, except with much cooler handwriting. But for ordinary people making ordinary transactions, you were stuck with physical coins, which meant 1. You needed somewhere secure to keep them. Theft was rampant. 2. You needed to actually carry them around, heavy and inconvenient. 3. You were limited in how much you could practically transport. 4. You were a walking target for thieves if anyone knew you were carrying significant money. This last point was such a concern that wealthy travelers would often disguise themselves as commoners and travel with minimal visible money, keeping their wealth in the form of credit notes or hiding coins in secret compartments in their clothing or saddles. Part 6. The Weird, the Wild, and the Weight That Was Money. Chapter 20. Africa's Alternative Currencies. Let's head to Africa, because African medieval monetary systems were doing their own thing, and honestly, it was fascinating. We already talked about salt in the Sahara trade, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the salt dune, whatever. In West Africa, various kingdoms and trading networks used some truly creative forms of money. The most famous? Cowrie shells. Cowrie shells are small, shiny, porcelain-like shells that come from sea snails found in the Indian Ocean. They're pretty, durable, and difficult to fake. You can't just make counterfeit shells easily. Most importantly, they came from far away, which made them exotic and valuable. Cowrie shells became the standard currency across huge swathes of West Africa. We're talking about regions spanning from modern-day Nigeria to Mali to the Sudan. For over 1,000 years, cowries were money. How valuable were they? Well, that varied by time and place, but generally, you needed a lot of cowries to buy anything significant. We're talking thousands or tens of thousands of shells for major purchases. This actually made them perfect for small transactions. You could count out exactly how many shells you needed for a bowl of grain or a chicken with no need for making change. The problem? The same problem with any currency: supply control. Cowrie shells came from the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, which meant someone had to ship them to Africa. Arab and later European traders figured out they could harvest cowries and import them to Africa, gradually increasing the supply. More supply meant inflation, and by the 19th century, so many cowries had flooded into Africa that they became almost worthless. But during the medieval period, the supply was more controlled, and cowries were a stable, widely accepted currency that facilitated trade across a massive region. Other African currencies included manila bracelets, copper or bronze bracelets used as currency in West Africa. They were standardized in weight and purity, but you could also wear them, which was convenient. Iron bars. In some regions, standardized iron bars were currency. They were valuable because iron was useful for making tools and weapons. Cloth strips. Specifically designed cloth strips served as money in various regions with standardized sizes and patterns. Chapter 21. The Rye Stones of Yap, or What If Money Was a Giant Rock? Okay, this one is technically from Micronesia, and whether it counts as medieval is debatable, but it's too good not to include, and the system was definitely operating during what would have been the medieval period in Europe, so we're counting it. On the island of Yap, they used limestone discs called rye stones as money. These weren't little coins. These were massive stone discs, some of them up to 12 feet in diameter and weighing several tons. You could not pocket these. You could barely move these. The stones were quarried on islands hundreds of miles away and transported to Yap by canoe, which was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Some people died in the process. This difficulty and risk is what gave the stones their value. Here's where it gets really interesting. Once a rye stone was on Yap, it often didn't physically move during transactions. The stone would just sit there, maybe in someone's front yard or on public land, and everyone would simply agree on who owned it. Ownership was tracked through oral tradition. Everyone in the community knew who owned which stone. If you bought something expensive, the stone's ownership would transfer to the seller, but the stone itself would stay put. It's like if your house was money, and when you spent it, the house stayed where it was, but everyone just agreed it belonged to someone else now. There's a famous story about a rye stone that sank to the bottom of the ocean during transport. The stone was never recovered, but everyone agreed it still existed and still had value. People continued to trade its ownership for generations, even though nobody had seen it in decades. It was underwater money, money that nobody could see, touch, or verify still existed. And it worked because everyone agreed it worked. This is honestly the purest expression of what money actually is, a shared belief system. Money has value because we collectively agree it has value. The rye stones just made this philosophical truth extremely literal. Chapter 22. Japanese Rice and the Samurai Salary. Let's hop over to Japan, where the medieval monetary system was equally interesting and based partly on something you eat at sushi restaurants, rice. In medieval Japan, particularly during the Heian period, 794 to 1185, and into the samurai era, the economy operated on a dual system: coins for merchants and urban transactions, and rice for everything else. Rice wasn't just food, it was the standard measure of wealth and the basis for taxation. The value of land was measured in koku, a unit equal to the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year, about 180 liters or 150 kilograms of rice. Samurai weren't paid in gold or silver, they were paid in rice. Their stipends were measured in koku of rice per year. A low-ranking samurai might receive 100 koku per year, while a daimyo, feudal lord, might control domains producing hundreds of thousands of koku. This system had some interesting implications. For one thing, a samurai's wealth was directly tied to agricultural productivity. Bad harvest? Your salary effectively went down. Good harvest? You're richer this year. It created a direct link between the military class and agricultural success, which theoretically incentivized samurai to care about farming efficiency. The other interesting thing is that rice is perishable. You can't hoard rice for decades like you can hoard gold. This meant that wealth had to be continually cycled through the economy. You couldn't just pile up rice in a warehouse and sit on it as a hedge against inflation. It would rot. This encouraged spending and investment rather than hoarding. Of course, Japan also used coins. Chinese coins were imported and used for smaller transactions, and Japan minted its own coins at various points. But rice remained the fundamental measure of significant wealth throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Imagine if modern executives were paid in bushels of wheat, and that was considered totally normal. Yeah, I make 50,000 bushels a year. Pretty good salary. That was basically the samurai experience. Chapter 23: Bills of Exchange and the Proto-Banking Revolution. All right, let's get back to Europe for a minute, because something really important was happening there by the later Middle Ages. The development of sophisticated financial instruments that were basically early versions of modern banking. We've mentioned letters of credit briefly, but let's dig into how revolutionary these were. The problem: you're a merchant in Venice. You need to buy wool in London, but carrying enough money to buy a shipload of wool from Venice to London is dangerous, expensive, you need guards, and inconvenient. Remember, we're talking about potentially hundreds of pounds of silver coins. The solution: bills of exchange. Here's how it worked. You'd go to a banker in Venice, probably one of the Italian banking families that specialized in this. You'd give them money in Venetian currency. They'd give you a bill of exchange, basically a fancy IOU, stating that their branch or partner in London would pay the holder of this bill a certain amount in English currency. You'd travel to London with just this piece of paper. When you got there, you'd present it to the London banker, who would pay you in local currency. You'd use that to buy your wool. The London banker would then settle up with the Venice banker through their own complex network of credits and debits. The brilliant part? This was all done at the current exchange rate, and the banker would take a commission for the service. But here's the sneaky genius part. The commission wasn't called a commission because charging interest on money was considered usury by the church and was technically sinful. Instead, the profit came from the exchange rate. The banker would give you a slightly unfavorable rate when exchanging currencies. It wasn't technically interest. It was just an exchange rate adjustment, totally different, not usury at all. The church bought this explanation, probably because the church itself used these same banking services. This system became incredibly sophisticated by the 14th and 15th centuries. Bankers developed complex networks spanning all of Europe and beyond. They created clearinghouses where debts could be settled without actually moving money. They developed early forms of accounting that tracked these transactions. The Medici Bank, at its height in the 15th century, had branches in London, Bruges, Avignon, Milan, Rome, Venice, Geneva, Lyon, and Basel. They could facilitate transactions anywhere in Western Europe without moving physical coins more than a short distance. This was basically the medieval Internet of finance. Information, in the form of bills of exchange, could flow quickly while the actual money stayed relatively stationary. It was revolutionary. Chapter 24: The Templars' Bank, or When Warrior Monks Did Finance. Speaking of medieval banking, we need to talk about the Knights Templar, because these guys accidentally invented international banking while trying to protect pilgrims. The Templars started as a military order during the Crusades. Their job was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. But they quickly noticed a problem. Pilgrims were getting robbed. A lot. Because they had to carry all their money with them. And pious person traveling with their life savings is basically a neon sign saying, "Rob me." The Templar solution was brilliant. You'd deposit your money at a Templar house in Europe, and they'd give you a letter of credit encrypted with a code only the Templars knew. You'd travel to the Holy Land carrying just this letter. When you arrived, you'd present it to a Templar house there, and they'd give you money. Boom. International banking. Protected by knights who'd taken vows of poverty, but somehow ended up running the most sophisticated financial network in Europe. The Templars became so good at this that they branched out. They started offering financial services to kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants. They facilitated loans. They held deposits. They became the default bankers for anyone doing business across long distances. They got so wealthy and powerful that eventually King Philip IV of France got nervous and deeply indebted to them. So in 1307, he had them all arrested on trumped-up charges of heresy. The order was dissolved, their assets seized, and many Templars were executed. But the banking practices they'd pioneered? Those stuck around. Other organizations and individuals took over their role. The basic concept of depositing money in one location and withdrawing it in another became standard practice. So next time you use an ATM to withdraw cash in a foreign country, pour one out for the Knights Templar who died so that your vacation finances could be convenient. Part 7. The Daily Grind of Medieval Money. Chapter 25. What could you actually buy with medieval money? Alright, let's get practical. All this talk about different coins and monetary systems is interesting, but what did medieval money actually get you? What was the purchasing power of these coins people were clipping, counterfeiting, and dying over? Let's start with England in the 13th century, because we have pretty good records from that time and place. A single silver penny, the basic unit of English currency, could buy you about 2 pounds of bread, the cheap dark bread that peasants ate, not the fancy stuff, a gallon of weak ale, which was safer to drink than water, so this was basically medieval soda, a dozen eggs, a pound of cheese, several candles. So a penny was roughly equivalent to maybe $5 to $10 in modern terms. It's hard to compare directly because medieval people spent their money on completely different things than we do, but you get the idea. It was enough to buy some basic food items, but not enough to live on for a day. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter, a mason, a blacksmith might earn 3 to 6 pence per day. That's enough for a fairly comfortable living if you were working regularly, but most medieval workers didn't work every day. There were lots of religious holidays, over 50 per year in some places, plus bad weather, seasonal work stoppages, and the general chaos of medieval life. An unskilled laborer might earn 1 to 2 pence per day. That's barely subsistence living. You could feed yourself, but not much else. Now, what about bigger purchases? A decent horse cost around 2 pounds, that's 480 pence. That's roughly 160 to 240 days of wages for a skilled craftsman, or about 8 to 12 months of work if you account for non-working days. So buying a horse was like a modern person buying a used car, a major purchase that required saving up. A suit of armor could cost anywhere from 5 pounds to 50 pounds depending on quality. The expensive stuff was equivalent to several years' wages. This is why knights were basically required to be from wealthy families. You couldn't knight someone who couldn't afford the equipment, and the equipment was phenomenally expensive. A nice house in a city might cost 10 to 20 pounds. A manor estate could run into the hundreds of pounds. These were generational wealth purchases, things you inherited or saved for your entire life. But here's what's wild. These prices were relatively stable for centuries. Unlike modern times where inflation steadily erodes purchasing power, medieval prices could stay basically the same for generations. A penny in 1250 bought you roughly the same amount of bread as a penny in 1150. Until, of course, something went catastrophically wrong, like a war, a famine, or a king deciding to debase the currency. Then prices could spike dramatically before eventually settling back down. Chapter 26. The Peasant Economy, or most people barely used money. Here's something that might surprise you. Most medieval people barely used money at all. Wait, what? After all this talk about coins and currency, you're telling me most people didn't use them? Exactly, because most people were peasants, and peasant economies ran primarily on barter, obligation, and payment in kind. Think about it. If you're a peasant farmer, you grow your own food. You might have some chickens, maybe a pig. Your house is made from materials you gathered locally. Your clothes are made from wool you sheared from sheep you or your neighbor owns, spun and woven by you or your family. What do you need money for? Well, a few things. You need to pay taxes, which might be demanded in coin. You might want to buy salt or iron tools, or occasionally some luxury like a piece of colored cloth. But most of your economic activity doesn't involve money changing hands. Instead, you operate on a complex web of obligations and barter. You help your neighbor with their harvest, and they'll help you with yours. You give the lord of the manor a portion of your crops and some labor on his lands, called corvée labor. And in exchange, you get to farm your plot and receive his protection, theoretically. You trade eggs to the village blacksmith for repairs to your plow. You swap wool for leather with the tanner. Money enters this economy in specific contexts. 1. When dealing with outsiders, traveling merchants. 2. When paying taxes or feudal dues that are demanded in coin. 3. When buying things that can't be produced locally, salt, metal tools, etc. 4. When dealing with urban markets. But day to day, most peasants might go weeks or months without handling a single coin. Some peasants never handled coins at all, living their entire lives in a moneyless economy. This is why medieval money seems so weird and complicated to us. It wasn't designed for everyday use by everyday people. It was designed for long-distance trade, urban commerce, taxation, and transactions between elites. The peasant economy, which was the economy for like 80 to 90% of the population, operated on completely different principles. Chapter 27, Market Day Madness. But then there was Market Day. Most villages and towns had a weekly or monthly market day where merchants would show up, peasants would bring surplus goods to sell, and actual money would change hands. These market days were chaos. Imagine a medieval marketplace. You've got peasants selling agricultural goods, grain, vegetables, eggs, chickens, wool, craftsmen selling manufactured goods, tools, cloth, pottery, leather goods, traveling merchants selling exotic goods, spices, fine cloth, metal goods, money changers set up at tables weighing and exchanging coins, food vendors selling prepared food, medieval fast food, entertainers trying to earn coins from the crowd, pickpockets working the crowd. Medieval crime is multitasking. Town officials monitoring weights and measures to prevent fraud. The occasional traveling preacher warning everyone about sin and money lending, and everyone is shouting, haggling, arguing about prices, questioning the quality of goods, testing coins, and generally making an enormous racket. The market was where the peasant economy intersected with the money economy. A peasant might sell a surplus chicken for a few pence, then immediately spend those pence on salt or a new knife. The money would pass through their hands in minutes, converting their agricultural surplus into goods they couldn't produce themselves. For urban dwellers, markets were more routine, just another day of commerce. But for rural peasants, market day was event. It was one of the few times they'd interact with the broader economy, see goods from far away, and handle actual coins. Markets were also heavily regulated. Every market had official measures for grain, official weights for meat, official standards for cloth. Merchants caught using false measures could be fined, put in the pillory, or banned from the market. Because in an economy where trust was essential and coins were sketchy to begin with, fraud in weights and measures was taken very seriously. There's a famous punishment in medieval London where bakers who sold underweight bread would be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame, with the offending bread hung around their necks. This was called being hurdled, and it was public humiliation designed to ruin the baker's reputation. Because in a world without consumer protection agencies, reputation was everything. Chapter 28, The Loan Shark Problem and Why Everyone Hated Moneylenders. Let's talk about something uncomfortable, medieval lending, and why it was a complete moral minefield. The Christian Church had a big problem with usury, charging interest on loans. The Bible explicitly condemns it in several places, and medieval theologians spent a lot of time arguing about whether any form of interest-bearing loan was acceptable. The official position was pretty clear. Charging interest was a sin. Money, they argued, was inherently sterile. It couldn't reproduce on its own. So charging someone for the use of money was unnatural and against God's law. You could lend money, sure, but you couldn't charge interest. This created some problems. Problem 1. If you can't charge interest, why would anyone lend money? Out of pure charity? That's nice in theory, but it doesn't create a functioning credit market. Problem 2. People desperately needed loans. Medieval life was precarious. A bad harvest, a sick cow, a house fire. Any of these could financially devastate a family. Without access to credit, people had no way to recover from setbacks. So people found workarounds, lots of workarounds. One common method, you'd sell your land to the lender with an agreement to buy it back later at a higher price. You got your loan, the initial sale price, and the lender got their interest, the difference between the sale and buyback price. It wasn't interest, it was just a business transaction. Totally different. The church generally disapproved, but often looked the other way. Another method, the lender would take control of your land while you repaid the loan, and they'd keep all the profits from the land during that time. Again, not technically interest, just a reasonable arrangement for the use of property. Or, you'd agree to repay the loan in a different currency than you borrowed, at an exchange rate that favored the lender. Not interest, just currency exchange. The most straightforward method was to just ignore the church's rules and charge interest anyway. Jewish moneylenders did this, since they weren't bound by Christian rules about usury. This made them incredibly useful to medieval Christian society. Someone has to provide credit, but also made them targets of resentment and persecution. Christian moneylenders existed too, but they had to be more creative in disguising their interest charges. The Italian bankers got very, very good at this, coming up with increasingly elaborate schemes to hide interest as fees, or exchange rate adjustments, or compensation for risk. The result was a lending market that kind of worked, but was morally compromised, legally questionable, and often exploitative. Interest rates, fees and adjustments, were typically high. 20 to 40% was common for short-term loans. This meant that if you were poor and needed a loan, you could easily end up in a debt spiral, owing more and more as interest compounded, as fees accumulated. This is why medieval people had such complicated feelings about moneylenders. On one hand, they provided an essential service. On the other hand, they were often seen as predatory. The stereotype of the evil moneylender squeezing poor people for everything they had. That stereotype existed in medieval times too, and like most stereotypes, it was based on real patterns of behavior, even if it was also unfairly applied to entire groups of people. Chapter 29. Women and Money. Yes, really. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention: women's participation in the medieval money economy. The default assumption in a lot of popular history is that medieval women didn't handle money, didn't work, and were basically locked in towers waiting to be rescued. This is, to put it mildly, complete nonsense. Medieval women were active participants in the economy at all levels. They worked, they earned money, they managed household finances, they ran businesses, and yes, they even engaged in international trade. Peasant women worked alongside men in agricultural labor. They also had their own economic activities, spinning and weaving, which could be sold, selling eggs and dairy products, working as servants, and various other forms of labor. The money they earned was often essential to household survival. In cities, women worked as craftspeople, shopkeepers, brewers. Brewing was often a female occupation, bakers, and in various other trades. In some guilds, women could be full members with the same rights as men. Widows often inherited their husbands' businesses and ran them successfully. Some women became quite wealthy through trade. There are records of women merchants engaged in international commerce, women moneylenders, women running large estates, and women patronizing artists and scholars. The famous Paston letters from the 15th century England include lots of correspondence from Margaret Paston, who managed the family estates, collected rents, negotiated with creditors, and generally handled the family's finances while her husband was away. And she was far from unique. Many noble and merchant class women had similar responsibilities. Now, were there legal restrictions on women's economic activities? Absolutely. In most places, married women technically operated under their husband's legal authority. But in practice, this was often a legal fiction that both parties worked around when convenient. Women routinely bought, sold, lent, borrowed, and conducted business in their own names or in their husband's name with his authorization, which was often automatic. Widows had it better in some ways. They had more legal independence and could control property and money in their own right. This is partly why remarriage rates for wealthy widows were relatively low. Many preferred their independence to acquiring another husband who would legally control their assets. The point is, when we talk about medieval money, we're not just talking about men. Women were earning it, spending it, saving it, lending it, investing it, and occasionally counterfeiting it. Yes, there are records of women being executed for counterfeiting. The medieval economy included women at every level. Part 8. The End of Medieval Money. Chapter 30. When everything started changing. So when did medieval money stop being medieval? There's no single answer because different regions transitioned at different times. But generally, we're looking at the 15th and 16th centuries as the period when medieval monetary systems started giving way to early modern ones. Several things drove this transition. First, the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration brought massive amounts of new silver and gold into Europe. Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, gaining access to enormous silver mines in South America, particularly Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. This silver flooded European markets, causing inflation but also massively increasing the money supply. When you go from, we have to carefully manage our limited precious metals, to, we have literally shiploads of silver arriving regularly, everything changes. Medieval monetary caution gave way to early modern monetary expansion. Second, the rise of stronger centralized nation-states meant more uniform currency systems. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of thousands of different authorities all minting their own coins. By the 16th and 17th centuries, nation-states like England, France, and Spain were asserting more control over currency, reducing the chaos of competing local coinages. Third, printing technology and paper money. We've talked about how China had paper money in the medieval period, but Europe was late to the game. Sweden issued the first European paper money in 1661, and other nations gradually followed. Paper money allowed for much larger denominations and easier transport than coins. Fourth, better banking and credit systems. The financial instruments that Italian bankers had pioneered in the medieval period became more widespread and sophisticated. By the 17th century, deposit banking, checks, banknotes, and credit were becoming normal parts of European commerce. Fifth, the Protestant Reformation changed attitudes toward lending and interest. Protestant theologians, particularly John Calvin, developed justifications for charging interest on loans. This made credit markets more transparent and efficient, since you didn't have to disguise interest as fees anymore. Chapter 31. The Great Recoinage and Milled Edges. Let's zoom in on one specific moment in the transition: England's Great Recoinage of 1696. By the 1690s, England's coinage was in crisis. We talked earlier about clipping, and how it had gotten so bad that roughly half of all coins in circulation were underweight. The economy was struggling because nobody trusted the money. The government decided on a radical solution: call in all the old coins, melt them down, and mint entirely new coins with milled edges, those little ridges that make clipping obvious. This was an enormous undertaking. Every old coin in the kingdom had to be brought to authorized locations and exchanged for new coins. The new coins would be minted with the correct weight and with anti-clipping technology built in. The project was a nightmare. The government underestimated how long it would take to mint enough new coins. There were coin shortages. Economic activity ground to a halt in some regions because there literally wasn't enough money in circulation. People rioted. The government nearly collapsed, but they pushed through, and by 1699, England had a new, standardized, clipper-proof coinage. This became the model for other nations. The Great Recoinage represented the end of medieval attitudes toward money and the beginning of modern monetary management. Interestingly, this recoinage was overseen in part by Isaac Newton, who was master of the Royal Mint from 1699 to 1727. Yes, that Isaac Newton. The guy who discovered gravity and invented calculus spent years of his life hunting counterfeiters and managing coin production. He apparently took it very seriously, personally interrogating suspects and sending several counterfeiters to the gallows. So if you ever feel like you're not living up to your potential, remember that Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds in history, spent a significant portion of his life making sure coins had the right amount of silver in them. Everybody's got to pay the bills. Chapter 32. What medieval money teaches us about money in general. Here's the thing about medieval money. It seems weird to us because we're used to modern money, but modern money is actually way weirder. Think about it. Medieval people used coins made of precious metals. The coins had intrinsic value. You could melt them down and the metal was worth something. Sure, there was also symbolic value. The king's stamp gave the coin legitimacy, but there was real metal there. Modern money? It's paper. Or increasingly, it's not even paper. It's digital bits in a computer. A dollar bill costs a few cents to print, but we all agree it's worth $1. Modern money has no intrinsic value whatsoever. It's pure belief, pure trust in the system. In that sense, the Rye Stones of Yap, those giant rocks that nobody moved but everyone agreed had value, are actually closer to modern money than medieval coins were. Because money is ultimately just a shared agreement, a collective hallucination that we all participate in because it's useful. Medieval people understood this on some level. They knew that money was about trust. That's why counterfeiting was such a serious crime. It violated the fundamental trust that made the system work. That's why coin debasement made people so angry. It was a betrayal of trust by the authority that guaranteed the money. That's why merchants spent so much effort testing coins. They couldn't rely on trust alone, so they needed verification. That's why elaborate bills of exchange worked, because the banking family's reputation was solid enough that people trusted their paper. Medieval money was complicated, chaotic, and constantly subject to manipulation. But in its mess and complexity, it reveals something fundamental about money itself. It only works if enough people believe in it, and maintaining that belief requires constant work. Modern monetary systems are more stable and standardized than medieval ones, but they're not fundamentally different. We still worry about inflation, currency debasement by another name. We still need authorities to manage the money supply and prevent counterfeiting. We still rely on trust in institutions. The medieval merchant testing a coin with a touchstone and the modern person checking whether a website is secure before entering their credit card number are doing the same thing, verifying trust before engaging in a transaction. Chapter 33. The Last Medieval Coins. So when did the last truly medieval coins disappear? Again, it depends on where you are. Some English silver pennies from the medieval period remained in circulation into the 17th century, though they were increasingly rare. Spanish pieces of 8, silver coins first minted in the 1490s, circulated globally well into the 1800s, and influenced currency systems worldwide, including inspiring the US dollar. But by the 18th century, most obviously, medieval coins had been replaced by early modern and modern coinage. The symbolic end might be 1971 when Britain decimalized its currency, and finally abandoned the pounds, shillings, pence system that dated back to Charlemagne. That system had lasted over 1,100 years. Today, medieval coins are collector's items, museum pieces, or treasure finds. When archaeologists dig up a hoard of medieval coins, it makes the news. These coins are windows into the past, physical objects that connect us to people who lived centuries ago. But the principles behind medieval money, the need for trust, the importance of standardization, the tension between intrinsic and symbolic value, the role of authority in guaranteeing currency, these are still with us. They're still relevant. Every time there's a debate about cryptocurrency, we're essentially rehashing medieval arguments about what gives money value. Every time there's a financial crisis, we're dealing with medieval problems of trust and verification. Every time a government tries to manage inflation, they're grappling with the same issues medieval kings faced when they debased coins. Medieval money isn't as foreign as it seems. We're still dealing with the same fundamental questions they dealt with. We just have better technology and fancier terminology. Part 9. The Merchant's Survival Guide. Chapter 34. Why everyone was obsessed with weighing things. Picture this. You're a merchant in 14th century Bruges, one of the wealthiest trading cities in Europe. A customer walks into your shop wanting to buy expensive Flemish cloth. They pull out a handful of coins, German Groschen, French deniers, English pennies, and what might be a Venetian grosso, but could also be a really good fake. Your first move? You don't even look at the customer. You look at your scales. Because here's what medieval merchants understood that we've completely forgotten. Weight was truth. A coin could have the king's face stamped on it. It could have the right design. It could even have the right feel in your hand. But if it didn't weigh what it was supposed to weigh, it was garbage. Every serious merchant had a set of precision scales. Not the crude balance scales you see in movies. We're talking about sophisticated instruments that could detect differences of a fraction of a gram. These weren't cheap. A good set of merchant scales could cost several weeks' wages, but they were absolutely essential. Why? Because every coin that crossed your counter was suspect until proven otherwise. Clipped? Probably. Debased? Maybe. Counterfeit? Wouldn't be surprised. You weren't being paranoid, you were being realistic. Merchants kept detailed records of what coins from different mints were supposed to weigh. They'd have little reference books, usually hand-copied manuscripts, that listed hundreds of different coin types with their official weights. It was like carrying around a medieval cryptocurrency blockchain, except instead of verifying transactions with computer algorithms, you verified them with a precision scale and a lot of squinting. The really successful merchants could eyeball a coin and tell you within a tenth of a gram what it weighed. They developed this skill over decades of handling thousands of coins. It's like how modern bartenders can free pour a perfect shot, except instead of impressing people at parties, this skill prevented you from going bankrupt. Chapter 35. The Touchstone Technique, Medieval Chemistry at the Counter. But weight wasn't everything. A counterfeiter could make a coin the correct weight by using the right proportions of silver and base metal. So merchants needed another test, the touchstone. A touchstone was a piece of dark, fine-grained stone, usually black jasper or slate. When you rubbed a silver coin on it, it left a streak. The color of that streak told you about the purity of the silver. Pure silver left a different colored streak than silver, mixed with copper or lead. Experienced merchants had reference streaks on their touchstones from coins of known purity. They'd rub your suspicious coin on the stone, compare the streak to their references, and know instantly whether your coin was legit or whether you were trying to pull a fast one. This wasn't pseudoscience, it was real chemistry. Different metal compositions left different colored marks. A merchant who mastered the touchstone technique was basically running a portable metallurgy lab from their counter. But here's where it gets interesting. Using a touchstone was mildly destructive. You were rubbing the coin on stone, which removed a tiny amount of metal. Do this enough times, and you've effectively clipped the coin yourself. So there was this constant tension between verification and preservation. Test every coin thoroughly and you're damaging them. Don't test enough and you're accepting counterfeits. The solution? Merchants developed a sort of risk-based approach. Small transactions with regular customers, quick weight check, maybe a visual inspection, good enough. Large transactions with strangers, full battery of tests, weight, touchstone, maybe even a bite test. Biting coins was actually a thing. Soft metals like gold and silver would show tooth marks while harder base metals wouldn't. For really suspicious coins or really large transactions, merchants would do a full assay. This meant cutting the coin open or drilling into it to see if it was silver all the way through or just silver plated. Obviously, this destroyed the coin, so you'd only do this if you had serious doubts. But better to destroy one suspicious coin than accept 100 counterfeits. Chapter 36: The Money Changer's Apprentice, or How to Learn 500 Coins in 5 Years. If you wanted to become a money changer in medieval Europe, you didn't just hang out a shingle and start swapping coins. Oh no, you needed training, years of training. A typical money changer apprenticeship lasted 5 to 7 years. During that time, you had to learn the appearance, weight, and composition of hundreds of different coin types, how to spot counterfeits from dozens of different mints, exchange rates between all major currencies, which changed constantly, basic metallurgy and assaying techniques, arithmetic, harder than you think when you're using Roman numerals, how to read and write, not a given in medieval times, local laws regarding currency exchange and usury, how to spot someone trying to scam you, how to avoid being murdered by angry customers or robbed by criminals. That last one wasn't a joke. Money changers sat at tables in public spaces surrounded by money. They were obvious targets for theft and violence. Many kept weapons under their tables, and most had arrangements with local authorities for protection. The training process was intense. Young apprentices would start by just watching their master work, learning to identify coins by sight. They'd spend hours handling coins, feeling the weight of them, memorizing the details of different designs. It's like being a sommelier, except instead of learning wines, you're learning medieval currency. After a year or two, they'd graduate to actually performing simple exchanges under supervision. Then more complex exchanges. Then independent work for small transactions. By the end of their apprenticeship, they could handle any coin from Western Europe, detect most counterfeits at a glance, and calculate complex exchange rates in their heads. The truly skilled money changers were walking databases of numismatic information. They could tell you not just what a coin was worth, but when it was minted, what mint it came from, and approximately how many times it had been clipped based on the wear patterns on the edges. They were money detectives, and they charged accordingly. A money changer who'd completed a full apprenticeship and established a reputation could make a very comfortable living. Some became wealthy enough to transition into banking, lending, and international finance. The Medici family started as money changers. So did many other banking dynasties. Chapter 37: The Traveling Merchant's Nightmare. Now let's talk about what happened when you tried to do business across borders. Spoiler, it was a disaster. You're a cloth merchant from England. You've bought a shipment of high-quality wool, and you want to sell it in Flanders, modern-day Belgium, where the textile industry will pay top price. Great business plan. One problem: your English pennies are basically worthless in Flanders. Well, not worthless, but heavily discounted, and that discount varies depending on the mint that produced the pennies, the current exchange rate, which might have changed since yesterday, how much the money changer trusts English currency this month, whether anyone has recently flooded the market with clipped or counterfeit English pennies, the phase of the moon. Okay, not really, but it might as well have been. So you arrive in Bruges with your wool and your English pennies. First stop, the money changer. You need local currency to do business. The money changer looks at your pennies with the enthusiasm of someone being offered expired milk. He weighs them. He tests them with a touchstone. He examines each one individually. This takes hours. Finally, he announces his exchange rate. It's terrible. You argue. He shrugs. You can take it or leave it, and he knows you need Flemish currency. You take it. But now you've lost 10% of your money to exchange fees and unfavorable rates, and you haven't even started selling your wool yet. You sell your wool. Business is good. You've made a profit even after the currency exchange losses. Now you want to take your Flemish coins back to England and buy more wool. But wait, you need to exchange the Flemish coins back into English pennies. Another exchange, another round of fees, another 10% gone. This is why international merchants used bills of exchange whenever possible. Carrying coins across borders was expensive, dangerous, and involved getting fleeced by money changers at both ends. Bills of exchange meant you could keep the actual coins in one place and just move paper around. But small merchants couldn't always access the banking networks that made bills of exchange possible. So they ate the costs, factored it into their prices, and tried not to think too hard about how much money they were losing to currency exchange. Some merchants got creative. They'd try to spend their foreign coins directly without exchanging them, hoping vendors would accept them. This sometimes worked in major trading cities where merchants were used to foreign currency. But in smaller towns? Good luck. Your German Groschen might as well have been from Mars. Chapter 38. The Black Market Money Trade. Here's something the official histories don't always emphasize. There was a thriving black market in currency exchange. Official money changers had licenses, paid taxes, and, theoretically, followed the rules. They charged high fees because they could. They were the only legal game in town. But humans being humans, unofficial money changers operated everywhere. They'd offer better exchange rates than the official changers, conduct transactions in back alleys or taverns, and generally ignore all the regulations about proper testing and record keeping. Why would anyone use these sketchy operators? Better rates, faster service, and fewer questions asked. If you were doing business that you didn't want officially recorded, black market money changers were your friend. Of course, using unofficial money changers came with risks. They might give you counterfeit coins, they might shortchange you, they might rob you. But for merchants willing to take those risks, the black market offered opportunities that official channels didn't. This created a two-tier currency system in many cities. Official transactions went through licensed money changers at official rates. Unofficial transactions happened in the shadows at street rates that better reflected actual market conditions. Authorities tried to crack down on this, but it was basically impossible to stop. You can't prevent people from privately agreeing to exchange money. The best authorities could do was make examples of the black market changers they caught, usually through heavy fines or public humiliation. In some cities, the underground currency market was so large and sophisticated that it effectively set the real exchange rates, while the official rates were just fiction that everyone ignored. It's like how today, some countries have official exchange rates and actual black market rates that are completely different. Medieval times weren't so different. Chapter 39. When your money became worthless. Overnight. Let's talk about every medieval person's financial nightmare. Currency recall. Here's how it worked. The king or prince or duke who controlled your region would suddenly announce that all the old coins were no longer valid. Everyone had to bring their old coins to authorized locations and exchange them for new coins. Sounds reasonable, right? Like the great recoinage we discussed earlier? Except here's the catch. The exchange rate was terrible. You'd bring in 10 old coins and get 8 new ones back, or 7, or 5. The authorities would keep the difference. Why did rulers do this? Money. They always needed money. And forcing everyone to exchange their coins at unfavorable rates was basically a wealth tax that they could implement without calling it a tax. Clever, evil, and extremely profitable. The announcement would typically come with very little warning. You'd have maybe a few weeks or months to exchange your coins before they became completely worthless. This created panic. Everyone would rush to exchange their coins, creating massive lines at official exchange points, or they'd try to spend their old coins as fast as possible before the deadline, creating brief economic booms followed by crashes. Some people would try to hoard their old coins, hoping the recall would be reversed. It never was. They'd end up with piles of worthless metal. Others would try to flee to neighboring territories where their coins were still good, exchanging them there. This led to currency flight, which really annoyed the authorities who were trying to confiscate everyone's money. The really painful part? This could happen repeatedly. Some territories did currency recalls every few years. Imagine if every few years, your government announced that all dollars were now worthless, and you had to exchange them for new dollars at 70 cents on the dollar. You'd riot. Medieval people just grumbled and paid up, because what choice did they have? This is one reason why people converted money into other forms of wealth when they could. Land, buildings, commodities, precious objects, these couldn't be recalled. Your coins might become worthless overnight, but your house wouldn't. Chapter 40. The Psychology of Medieval Money Anxiety. All of this created a specific kind of financial anxiety that medieval people lived with constantly. Your money wasn't secure. It could lose value overnight through debasement, recall, or just bad luck with clipping. The coins in your pocket might be rejected at the next town over. The king might decide to mess with the currency next week. This had psychological effects. Medieval people were simultaneously more casual about money, because it was just metal after all, and more anxious about it, because it could lose value suddenly. They thought about money differently than we do. Modern people think of money as abstract value. A number in a bank account, a piece of plastic, a digital transfer. We trust that $1 tomorrow will be worth approximately $1 today, inflation notwithstanding. Medieval people thought of money as physical stuff that had to be constantly verified and defended against a world trying to cheat them. They trusted money less and worked harder to protect it. This led to some interesting behaviors. Hiding money was extremely common. People buried coins, hid them in walls, sewed them into clothing. This is why metal detector enthusiasts keep finding medieval coin hoards. People hid their money and died before recovering it. Spending money quickly was often preferable to saving it. If your coins might be worth less next month, better to convert them into goods now. Investing in tangible assets made sense. Land, buildings, tools, livestock, these had value that couldn't be debased or recalled. Diversifying your currency holdings was smart. Don't keep all your wealth in one type of coin. If English pennies get recalled, maybe your French deniers will still be good. This financial anxiety shaped medieval economic behavior in ways that seem strange to us, but made perfect sense in their context. They weren't being irrational. They were being appropriately cautious in a monetary system that was genuinely unstable. Part 10. The Global Money Network. Chapter 41. The Silk Road's Currency Chaos. Let's zoom out from Europe for a bit and talk about what happened when multiple monetary systems collided on the greatest trade route in history, the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't one road. It was a network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean, passing through Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. Goods traveled these routes, but more importantly for our purposes, so did money. A merchant traveling the full length of the Silk Road would encounter dozens of different currencies. Chinese copper cash in the east, Central Asian dirhams in the middle, Byzantine solidi and European coins in the west, plus hundreds of regional and local currencies that barely circulated beyond their immediate area. How did anyone conduct business under these conditions? The answer is, with great difficulty and lots of money changers. Major trading cities along the Silk Road became currency exchange hubs. Samarkand, Bukhara, Baghdad, Constantinople. These cities had entire districts devoted to money changing and banking. Merchants would arrive with one currency and leave with another, paying hefty fees for the privilege. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all this chaos, the system worked. Goods flowed across Asia and into Europe. Merchants made profits. Trade flourished. How? Partly through the use of commodity money. Silk itself served as a form of currency. Standardized bolts of silk had known values and were accepted across wide areas. Silver bullion, uncoined silver, was universally valuable and could be exchanged anywhere. Precious stones served as portable wealth that didn't depend on any particular currency system, and partly through the development of sophisticated credit instruments. Muslim merchants pioneered the use of sak, checks, hawala, money transfer systems, and other financial tools that let them move value without moving physical currency. These systems were so advanced that they're still used in some parts of the world today. The Silk Road also saw incredible innovations in currency exchange. The Mongol Empire, which controlled huge stretches of the Silk Road in the 13th and 14th centuries, actually tried to standardize currency across their entire empire. They issued paper money that was supposed to be accepted from China to Eastern Europe. Did it work? Kind of. In theory, you could use Mongol paper money anywhere in the empire. In practice, people preferred coins or commodity money, especially in the western parts of the empire where paper money seemed like weird Eastern magic. But the attempt was there, and it showed a sophisticated understanding of how convenient uniform currency could be. Chapter 42: The Spice Islands and Shell Money. Let's head to Southeast Asia, because the monetary systems there were equally wild. The Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia and surrounding areas, were the source of nutmeg, cloves, mace, and other spices that were worth their weight in gold in medieval Europe. These islands were where the real money was made, literally and figuratively. The local currency systems in this region used a mix of Chinese coins, Indian coins, Islamic coins, and local currencies. But the most interesting currency was one we've already mentioned: cowrie shells. Cowries were the universal small change of the Indian Ocean trade network. They were used from East Africa to Southeast Asia, across an area covering millions of square miles. This was the most geographically widespread currency system in the medieval world. Why cowries? They were perfect money for tropical environments. They didn't rust or corrode. They were small and portable. They came in relatively standardized sizes. They were hard to fake. Try counterfeiting a natural shell. And they were beautiful, which didn't hurt. The value of cowries varied by region, but generally, you needed thousands of them to equal the value of a silver coin. This made them perfect for small transactions. Want to buy some rice? That'll be 30 cowries. A chicken? Maybe 300 cowries. A day's labor? 1,000 cowries or so. For larger transactions, people used silver, gold, or commodity money. But for the everyday economy, cowries were the standard. The interesting thing is that cowries came from a limited area, primarily the Maldives and a few other locations in the Indian Ocean. This meant that someone had to harvest them, transport them, and distribute them across a vast trade network. There was an entire cowrie supply chain, basically the medieval equivalent of the Federal Reserve System, except instead of printing money, they were diving for shells. Chapter 43: The Great Zimbabwe and the Gold Trade. Let's head to Africa, specifically to Great Zimbabwe, because the monetary situation there blows apart a lot of assumptions about medieval African economics. Great Zimbabwe was a massive stone city and the capital of a wealthy trading empire in southeastern Africa from the 11th to 15th centuries. This empire controlled the gold trade from the interior of Africa to the coast, where it connected with Indian Ocean trade networks. Gold from Great Zimbabwe went to the Swahili coast, then to India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. This gold helped fuel the monetary systems of multiple civilizations. That gold dinar you're using in Cairo might have started as ore in Zimbabwe. But here's the interesting part. Great Zimbabwe itself didn't use gold coins. They used gold as a commodity for trade, but their internal economy operated on different principles. The local currency was a mix of iron implements, hoes, bells, copper ingots, and glass beads imported from India. These items had both practical value, iron for tools, copper for crafts, beads for decoration, and symbolic value as currency. This was incredibly pragmatic. Gold was valuable for trade, so they exported it. But for local use, iron and copper were more practical. You couldn't eat gold, but you could make tools with iron. The Zimbabwe economy prioritized usefulness over abstract value. This pattern repeated across medieval Africa. Coastal trading cities that interfaced with international trade networks used coins, Islamic dinars and dirhams, plus local coinages influenced by Islamic models. But interior regions often used commodity money that served dual purposes, currency and practical goods. It's a reminder that sophisticated doesn't necessarily mean using coins. The great Zimbabwe economic system was sophisticated in its practicality, adapting currency to local needs rather than blindly copying foreign models. Chapter 44: Indian Ocean Trade and the Everything Currency. The Indian Ocean Trade Network connected East Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. It was the most economically integrated region of the medieval world, and its currency situation was bonkers in the best way. In Indian Ocean ports, you could use almost any currency. Islamic dinars and dirhams? Sure. Chinese cash? Yep. Indian coins? Obviously. Cowrie shells? Always. Silver bullion? Why not? Spices? They're basically money. Silk? Also money. Precious stones? Money. Basically, if it had value and could be transported, you could probably spend it somewhere in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. This created a weird situation where merchants had to be experts in literally everything that could serve as currency. You needed to know the current exchange rates between dozens of currencies, the current market prices for various commodities, the quality grades of different types of silk or spices, and the going rates for precious stones. Indian Ocean merchants were walking encyclopedias of economic information. They had to be, because any transaction might involve converting between multiple forms of value. I'll trade you 3 bolts of Chinese silk and 2,000 cowrie shells for your Persian carpets and a pound of cloves. Deal, but I want payment in part silver and part Indian textiles. Fine, but the exchange rate is... These negotiations could take days. Merchants would compare values, check current market conditions, assess quality, and eventually reach agreements that satisfied everyone. It was like extreme haggling meets international finance. And it worked. The Indian Ocean Trade Network was phenomenally successful, moving enormous quantities of goods and creating wealth across a vast area. The flexibility of accepting multiple currencies was a feature, not a bug. It made trade possible between regions that would otherwise have struggled to exchange value. Chapter 45: When Cultures Collided, the Crusader Currency Crisis. The Crusades created an interesting monetary laboratory. What happens when Western European Christians conquer territory in the Middle East and have to figure out how to run an economy? The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its vassals, faced an immediate currency problem. The local population used Islamic dinars and dirhams. European crusaders brought European coins. Neither group trusted the other's money. The solution? The Crusader states minted their own coins that tried to satisfy everyone and ended up satisfying no one. They created coins that looked like Islamic dinars but with Christian symbols and Latin inscriptions. They created coins with Arabic inscriptions but Christian imagery. They created hybrid coins that mixed elements from both traditions. It was monetary multiculturalism taken to a confusing extreme. The result was predictable. Most people just kept using the coins they trusted. Muslims in Crusader territories kept using Islamic coins when they could. Europeans used European coins. The Crusader coins were mostly used for official transactions where you had no choice. Over time, some Crusader coinages gained acceptance. The Venetian-influenced coins from the Kingdom of Jerusalem became reasonably well trusted, but it took generations, and even then, Islamic dinars remained the preferred currency for large transactions because they had better reputations. This is a perfect example of how money is fundamentally about trust. You can force people to accept your currency for tax payments, but you can't force them to trust it for voluntary transactions. The Crusader states learned this lesson the hard way. Part 11. The Dark Side of Medieval Money. Chapter 46. The Jewish Money Lending Question, a Complicated Mess. Okay, we need to talk about something uncomfortable. The role of Jewish moneylenders in medieval Europe and why this topic is so fraught with historical distortion. Here are the facts. In medieval Christian Europe, Jews were legally barred from most professions. They couldn't own land in many places. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't hold government positions. But they were allowed to lend money at interest, which Christians were officially forbidden to do. This created a terrible situation. Christian society needed credit markets to function, but Christians couldn't officially provide that service without committing the sin of usury. So the solution was to let Jews do it, benefit from their services, and then resent them for providing those services. Jewish moneylenders served an essential economic function. They provided capital for everything from royal wars to peasant emergencies. Without them, the medieval economy would have struggled to grow. But because they were the visible face of lending, and because debtors always resent creditors, Jewish moneylenders became targets of hostility. When someone couldn't pay their debts, they blamed the lender, not their own financial decisions. When kings owed too much money, they'd sometimes just expel all the Jews and cancel the debts. Problem solved, right? No. The problem was not solved. This was terrible. This pattern repeated across medieval Europe. Jews would be allowed in, would establish themselves in finance and trade, would become successful, and would then face persecution, expulsion, or worse. The historical legacy of this is messy. Anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews and money stem partly from this period, but those stereotypes ignore the economic and legal constraints that pushed Jews into money lending in the first place. Jews didn't choose money lending because of some innate affinity for finance. They chose it because Christian society limited their options and then resented them for succeeding in the niches they were allowed to occupy. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Plenty of Christians lent money too. They just disguised it better. The Italian bankers we keep mentioning? Christian. The Templars? Christian. Medieval banking wasn't ethnically exclusive. It just had different rules and different social acceptability depending on who was doing it. Chapter 47. The Perils of Being Rich. Medieval Style. Let's talk about what happened if you were actually successful at accumulating wealth in the Middle Ages. First problem. Everyone knew you had money, and everyone wanted some. Kings would demand loans that would never be repaid. Nobles would expect gifts. Churches would pressure you for donations. Your own family would expect support, and criminals would target you for robbery. Second problem. Being visibly wealthy could be dangerous. Sumptuary laws in many places restricted what clothing and jewelry non-nobles could wear, even if they could afford it. This was partly about maintaining class distinctions, but it was also about preventing wealthy merchants and bankers from looking too rich, which might inspire jealousy or social unrest. Third problem. Your wealth could be confiscated at any time. If you were accused of a crime, real or trumped up, your property could be seized. If you died without heirs, your property reverted to the crown. If the king decided he needed money and you were Jewish, you might just get expelled and have everything taken. This made wealth management in medieval times a constant balancing act. You wanted to be rich enough to live comfortably and have influence, but you didn't want to be so visibly rich that you became a target. Successful medieval wealthy people developed strategies. They'd convert liquid wealth into land and buildings, which were harder to steal and provided steady income. They'd diversify geographically, maintaining assets in multiple jurisdictions so that if one went bad, They weren't wiped out. They'd cultivate relationships with powerful people who could protect them, often through gifts and loans that bought goodwill. They'd maintain multiple identities or fronts, hiding the full extent of their wealth. They'd invest in their communities, funding churches, hospitals, and public works to buy social capital and protection. It was exhausting. Modern wealthy people complain about taxes, but at least the government can't just decide to expel you and take everything you own on a whim. Medieval wealthy people lived with that possibility constantly. Chapter 48. The Great Bullion Famines. Here's something that medieval people worried about constantly, but that we barely think about: running out of money. Not your personal money, literally all the money. Several times during the Middle Ages, Europe experienced bullion famines, periods when there simply wasn't enough silver or gold in circulation to support the economy. Existing coins got clipped, hoarded, exported, or worn down through use, and there wasn't enough new metal coming in to replace what was lost. When this happened, economies contracted, trade decreased, people reverted to barter, prices became unstable. It was basically a deflationary spiral, except instead of money losing value, there was literally just less money around. The worst bullion famine hit Europe in the 15th century. Silver production from European mines had declined. The Islamic world was absorbing a lot of European silver through trade deficits. Europe wanted spices and silk. The Islamic world wanted silver. The Byzantine Empire had collapsed, disrupting traditional trade routes. The result? There weren't enough coins. Economic activity slowed, prices deflated, people hoarded what money they had, making the problem worse. This is why the discovery of massive silver deposits in the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was such a big deal. Suddenly, there was silver everywhere, ships full of it, more silver than Europe had seen in centuries. This ended the bullion famine but caused its own problems. Hello, inflation. The bullion famines taught medieval people that money isn't just abstract value, it's physical stuff, and you can run out of it. Modern economies can print more money, with all the complications that entails, but medieval economies were constrained by how much precious metal they could dig out of the ground or acquire through trade. Chapter 49. Forgery as Art, the really good counterfeits. Most counterfeiting in the Middle Ages was crude, base metal with a thin coating of silver, or lightweight coins trying to pass as full weight. These were easy to detect if you knew what you were doing, but every so often, someone would produce counterfeits so good that they fooled even expert money changers. These master counterfeiters were artists in their own terrible way. The best counterfeits used actual silver or gold, just not quite as much as official coins. They'd be made with stolen or copied dies from real mints. They'd be carefully aged to look like circulated coins rather than suspiciously fresh. They'd be distributed slowly and carefully to avoid flooding the market and arousing suspicion. Some counterfeit operations were remarkably sophisticated. There are records of counterfeit workshops that employed dozens of workers, operated for years, and produced coins so good that modern numismatists have trouble distinguishing them from genuine articles. The most famous medieval counterfeiter might be Maestro Adamo, who worked in the 13th century Italy. Dante puts him in hell, specifically in the 8th circle reserved for falsifiers, in the Divine Comedy. Adamo produced counterfeit Florentine florins that were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. He was eventually caught, tortured, and executed, but his coins circulated for decades before people realized they were fake. The scary thing? For every master counterfeiter who got caught, how many operated successfully and died wealthy, their crimes never discovered? We know about the counterfeiters who failed. The truly successful ones left no trace except their indistinguishable from real coins, still sitting in museums and private collections, their true nature unknown. Chapter 50. When pirates had better money than kingdoms. Let's talk about piracy and money, because this gets weird. Medieval and early modern pirates had a money problem. They stole coins from various sources, so they'd accumulate a hodgepodge of different currencies. Spanish pieces of 8, Portuguese cruzados, English guineas, Islamic dinars, whatever their victims happened to be carrying. Trying to spend this mixed bag of loot was problematic. Many of these coins weren't accepted in the ports where pirates tried to spend them, so pirates developed their own informal exchange rates and would trade coins among themselves to get the currencies they needed. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirate havens and free ports sometimes developed their own de facto monetary standards. Any coin was accepted at weight value. It didn't matter what kingdom minted it or what face was stamped on it. If it weighed X grams and tested as silver, it was worth X. This was actually more rational than the official monetary systems of most kingdoms. Pirates stripped away all the symbolic value, patriotic imagery, and royal authority from money and reduced it to pure commodity value. In the lawless zone of pirate ports, money was just metal, and metal was universally valuable. Some historians argue that pirate monetary practices influenced the development of more rational currency systems in legitimate trade. When you've seen that stripping away the nationalism and just weighing silver works fine, you start questioning why official systems are so complicated. Of course, pirates also produced their own counterfeits, stole dyes from captured ships, and generally engaged in all sorts of monetary mayhem. But in their own chaotic way, they demonstrated that money could work just fine without kings, kingdoms, or official sanctions. You just needed metal that people trusted and weights that people agreed on. This terrified governments, by the way. The idea that money could exist independent of state authority, that people could create their own monetary systems that ignored official currencies. That was revolutionary and dangerous. Much easier to hang the pirates and maintain the fiction that only official coins had value. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the absolute circus that was medieval money. And if your head is spinning right now, good. That means you understand. Medieval people's heads were spinning too. Let's recap what we've learned. Money in the Middle Ages was simultaneously simpler and more complicated than modern money. Simpler because it was mostly just pieces of metal with agreed-upon values. More complicated because there were thousands of different pieces of metal, each with different values, different acceptance rates, and different levels of trustworthiness. Medieval people had to be part-time metallurgists, mathematicians, and fraud detectives just to buy groceries. They lived with constant currency anxiety, never knowing when their money might be debased, recalled, or rejected. They watched their coins carefully because everyone from kings to common criminals was trying to steal value from their money. And yet, and this is the part that amazes me, the system worked. For 1,000 years, across continents, through wars and plagues and famines, medieval people figured out how to trade, how to save, how to invest, and how to build economies that supported cities, armies, churches, and eventually the Renaissance itself. They did it without computers, without central banks, without standardized testing equipment, without most of the tools we consider essential for a functioning economy. They did it with scales, touchstones, sharp eyes, and an enormous amount of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The medieval money system was chaotic, but it was a functional chaos. It adapted to local conditions, incorporated innovations from multiple cultures, and created a truly global trade network that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia centuries before the age of exploration. And here's the thing. We're still grappling with the same fundamental questions they grappled with. What gives money value? Medieval people debated whether it was the precious metal content or the authority of the issuer. We debate whether it's government backing or market confidence. Same question, different words. How do you prevent fraud and counterfeiting? Medieval people used touchstones and scales. We use holograms and blockchain. Different technology, same problem. How do you maintain trust in a monetary system? Medieval people relied on the reputation of mints and the authority of rulers. We rely on the credibility of central banks and governments. Still about trust. How do you facilitate international trade when different regions use different currencies? Medieval people used money changers and bills of exchange. We use foreign exchange markets and international banking. More sophisticated, but fundamentally the same challenge. The medieval experience with money teaches us that monetary systems are always imperfect, always evolving, and always require trust to function. The idea that we've solved money in the modern era is as much an illusion as the idea that medieval money was primitive and dysfunctional. Every monetary system reflects the society that creates it. Medieval money was decentralized, diverse, and often chaotic because medieval society was decentralized, diverse, and often chaotic. Modern money is more centralized and standardized because modern society is more centralized and standardized. Neither system is objectively better, they're just adapted to different contexts. So the next time someone tells you that cryptocurrency is going to revolutionize money, or that we need to return to the gold standard, or that modern monetary policy is too complicated, remember the medieval experience. Remember the merchant weighing coins by candlelight. Remember the money changer with his touchstone. Remember the peasant cutting a silver penny into quarters. Remember the Viking trader accepting Islamic dirhams in Sweden. Remember the Chinese paper money experiment. Remember the cowrie shells crossing the Indian Ocean. They were all trying to solve the same problems we're trying to solve. How do you measure value? How do you store wealth? How do you facilitate trade? How do you maintain trust? Medieval people didn't have all the answers, neither do we. But they kept trying, kept adapting, and kept building systems that worked well enough to support human civilization for 1,000 years. That's not bad for a bunch of people who thought cutting coins with scissors was a reasonable solution to the small change problem. So here's to medieval money. Weird, wonderful, occasionally made of literal garbage, but functional enough to help build the modern world. We may have moved beyond silver pennies and cowrie shells, but we're still asking the same questions and still learning that money is, at its core, just an agreement between people about what has value. And if that agreement involves giant stone discs that stay underwater, or salt bars traded across deserts, or paper notes from warrior monks, well, that just proves that humans can make anything work if enough of us believe in it. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into medieval monetary chaos. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more historical deep dives, and drop a comment letting me know what weird historical topic you want me to tackle next. And remember, next time you're annoyed because your credit card doesn't work at a particular store, just be grateful you don't have to carry a touchstone, a set of precision scales, and a reference guide to 500 different coin types just to buy bread. Medieval people worked hard for their money, and then they had to work even harder to make sure that money was actually worth something. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and always, always test your coins. See you in the next one.